My presumption is that when you're traveling under these kind of distress situations, oftentimes you're in the hold of something. An enslaved person was traveling for months and months over time in a hold of some place and not really familiar with the direction, but you wear the distance on the body. All right, so this is what's going to essentially happen. The idea is to set up these sort of mechanisms to have the viewer experience conditions of distance that are both sculptural and architectural at the same time. In our last collaboration at Colby College, we were interviewing this astronomer who was talking about the measurement of stars. And long story short, what her goal is to measure stars in different kinds of galaxies as we find them. So there's a mechanism to do that. And the mechanism is a series of black mirrors that throw light, essentially. So when they're doing this in the viewing space, they have a light system that goes down that says, oh, we're now becoming dark adaptive. When it hit me, I was like, wow, that's a really kind of interesting way to think about bringing people's senses in order.
Dark Adaptive is a loose performance collective of the three of us. Torkwase usually does the sculpture, kind of the visual material. Zach and I work to translate the visual material into more performative work.
I get really excited whenever you hand over that material, and each time is different. I'm always waiting to see how I can understand it and then respond to it and then articulate it and make it into a live thing.
We're all translating, but we're all sort of adapting and trying to get a kind of ideas across, mostly around justice. I Belong to the Distance responds to global trade, whether that's material, humans, the history of trade, both of enslaved Africans in the West and the East. What does it mean to use oceans as superhighways 100 years ago and today?
Torkwase originally wanted to actually have her sculptures on the water, but that didn't pan out, and so she was interested in the pearling industry at the turn of the 20th century, mid-19th century, and how a lot of enslaved Africans were actually used as pearl divers. That whole kind of legacy of the East African slave trade, and also thinking about, of course, coming across the water, but then also having water-based labor, forced labor. Once she sort of had to pull away from the water, I always think about Zach and I bringing the bodies back into her work. Zach represents this idea of a pearl diver, so they would dive with a rock, sort of sink to the ground, the ocean floor. They would kind of do this in rhythm, and they have maybe 30 men on the ship to do this.
I think Andres made a good point about, in his score, was that the enslaved people who were doing the pearl diving did it on a clock, right? So there are 3 different times in which the diving occurred. So I have a sort of throughway at the top, an insert. This piece happens as sort of a clock, right? So the insert above lets light in, sunlight in, and it creates this light source that then changes over time. So thinking about the sculpture that is also a kind of indicator of time and space. It's an architectural work that I'm using to frame the viewer in a particular space across the water. So those sculptures, just as the Graham foundations, are sort of markers of viewing a distance, a kind of space between land and water.
You know, that's why I love your work, because there's this foundation, this kind of deep research and a history that you pull into it, and then you bring it to this site, and it has a conversation with all the elements, right?
So I'm kind of imagining the experience of being underwater, especially for a deeper dive, as opposed to it being a vertical thing, bring it horizontal. So what can we do with Zach's body, or what can Zach do with his own body, of course, on this hardscape to kind of represent what would happen underwater. So
Torkwase wants me to activate this as an instrument, and so I have to like literally like activate this with my body. Andres is gonna start playing music before 1:30. You know, just to alert people, hey, something's happening here. People are gonna trickle over. Andres is set up here. I'm doing some movements right here. Maybe I flirt with the head. Boom.
No.